He wasn't ready for what he saw. At the auction, among the noise and cruelty, she stood, alone, defiant, untouchable. The last Apache woman left. And the moment their eyes met, nothing in his life would ever be the same. Watch closely. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's dive in. The sun was already dipping low when I rolled into Redstone Crossing, the wagon creaking under the weight of provisions I hadn't needed for years. Dust hung in the air like a persistent ghost, settling in the seams of my coat and the corners of my eyes. I didn't come to town to linger, to trade pleasantries, or to hear the old men recount stories of the war I had long left behind. I came for nails, coffee, lamp oil, and the whetstone I'd cracked in my last sharpening. Routine, simple, measured. This was my life, and I had done well keeping it so. But the sounds coming from the old livery yard pulled me from habit. Men were gathered close, their laughter rough and sharp, spitting into the dirt as if it were a competition. I could hear snippets of words: auction, last one left, worthless. My hands clenched the reins slightly tighter. The path narrowed, bodies pressing in, and I slowed not because I wanted to, but because I had to. And then I saw her, chained to a rough post, wrists raw and red, iron cutting into her skin. She stood upright, not stiff, not slumped, just upright, chin level, eyes unfocused but not empty. She didn't react to the jeers, the leers, or the careless leaning of men who thought they had power over her. Her dress, once carefully adorned with beads and fringe, was torn, ragged, exposing more than I wanted to admit. But it wasn't the exposure that hit me. It was the defiance in her stance, the refusal to kneel, to cry, to plead. 3 days at auction, they said, and she hadn't budged. I moved closer, boots sinking slightly in the dry dirt. Our eyes met. No plea, no hope, no friendliness. Just a reading, fast, precise, the way a person checks for threat and decides next steps. I knew that look. I had worn it myself after the war, in the mornings when memory alone haunted the quiet hills. I could leave, buy my supplies, return to the ranch, pretend I hadn't seen her. But I knew if I left, some man with less restraint would take his chance. I reached into my coat and felt the folded bills and coins I had counted twice that morning. I approached the man handling the trade and asked, low, steady, "How much?" The number was more than she was worth to him, less than what I had, but I didn't haggle. Coins and bills exchanged hands, chains fell. She didn't rub her wrists, didn't move until I had turned away. Then she stepped forward. Not because I had guided her, not because she trusted me, but because standing still wasn't safer than moving. She climbed into the wagon behind me, sitting on the plank seat, hands resting on her lap, shoulders steady. I noticed the cold settling from the north and the torn dress that would offer little protection. I took off my coat and held it toward her. She took it without a word, draping it over her legs, not wearing it. We left Redstone in silence, the mule team moving in rhythm I had known for decades. I didn't speak, and neither did she. My mind circled back to the land, the fences that needed repair, the feed, the broken hinge on the chicken coop, the winter approaching faster than last year. Her wrists were raw, her glance cautious. I wondered how long she had been navigating the world with that stillness, that careful vigilance that left nothing vulnerable. Her name, I would learn later, was Ahuli. Taken in a raid, dragged through miles of scrub and stone, stripped of language by men who laughed when she didn't answer, left unsold because pride does not bend itself for the comfort of others. Her mission: survive without giving up what made her herself. My mission had been simpler: keep the ranch alive, keep myself useful, remember the dead without letting their graves swallow the rest of my years. Bringing her home had not been in that plan. I didn't know what it meant now that I had. The sun set flat and orange across the land when we arrived. The fence line leaned, pasture grass thin, barn door stubborn. I pulled the wagon near the well and climbed down. She watched as I worked, studying the way I moved, taking measure of the cabin, the space. I offered a hand to help her down. She ignored it, stepping onto the dirt with bare feet, flinching at the rough ground for a moment, and then it was gone. The cabin held a single room with a small half-wall suggesting separation, with stove needing a new seal, table with uneven legs, 2 beds, mine and a smaller one built when my wife had grown sick. I gestured toward it. Hers, if she wanted it. No words about doors, chores, boundaries. I didn't pretend ownership. She took it all in, the smell of smoke and oil, the faint trace of soap left by my wife. A ring on the table I slid into my pocket without comment. I ladled stew into 2 bowls, one near her bed, one on the table. She ate on the floor, coat over her lap, eyes on the fire. Silence heavy but not hostile settled between us. I considered the work ahead, fences, feed, repairs, wondering if she would help or prefer to be left alone. After the meal, I washed the dishes, laid an extra blanket on her bed, stacked old feed sacks for a divider, planning privacy without needing to ask. Night came, fire banked, lamp out, and we both lay awake. Hours passed. Her presence was a fact now, quiet but unmistakable. I thought of the grave on the hill, where I would tell my wife the truth. I brought someone home because leaving her there felt like leaving you, and I couldn't do that again. Guilt rose, settled, but didn't rule me. Outside, coyotes called. Inside, warmth spread slowly across the floorboards. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly. Just alert. She hadn't run. That was something. Tomorrow would come, and so would the work. Morning broke with a brittle chill that bit through the thin cabin walls. I was awake before the light, moving in the practiced silence of decades spent alone. The wooden floor creaked faintly beneath my bare feet, the sound muted against the early wind pressing at the cabin. The stove had cooled, the embers long dead, and I added fresh kindling, letting the flames leap to life and chase the dark corners away. She was still on the floor beside the stove, wrapped in the coat I had given her. Her hair fell across her face in loose waves, braided in places, tangled in others, a reminder of journeys made under wind and sun. She had slept little, I could tell. The faint lines on her brow and the set of her shoulders betrayed nights of vigilance. I moved outside to tend the animals, the cold greeting me like an old adversary. The pasture was quiet, save for the soft cluck of hens and the lowing of mules. I fed them with the same careful rhythm I had followed for years. Cracked oats for the mule, scattered feed for the hens, water from the trough broken through a thin layer of ice. Every motion was deliberate, precise, a meditation in labor. I knew the land intimately, the tilt of the fence posts, the weak spots in the barn, the stones that would trip an unpracticed foot. But now, as my eyes traced the perimeter, I noticed smaller footprints beside mine, careful and deliberate, yet hesitant. She had followed me. By the time I returned to the cabin, she was upright, standing by the window with her arms crossed, the coat still around her shoulders. Her eyes followed me as I set down the water buckets, but there was no urgency, no fear. She was observing, learning the rhythm of life here, gauging her place without being forced. I placed a tin cup of coffee near her bed, black, no sugar, letting the fact of it exist without pressing her to consume it. She looked, nodded slightly, and stepped back. That was her choice, and I respected it. We moved through the morning without words. I split kindling, checking the stove seal. She examined the small tasks I performed, her hands occasionally brushing against tools as if remembering old muscle memory. At first, it was slow, deliberate observation. Then, when I handed her a mallet to pound a stubborn peg into the fence, she took it without hesitation, the swing of her arm precise, capable. Her hands were rough, calloused in a way that spoke of labor, of survival. I watched, noting the fluidity of her motion, the way she respected the wood, the tool, the land itself. The wind had picked up, swirling dust and loose straw into small eddies around our boots. She worked silently, following my lead, then stepping ahead with tasks she intuitively understood. There was no instruction, no coercion, only the rhythm of movement, the unspoken language of labor. By midday, we paused, resting on a log. I offered a small piece of dried meat and bread, and she accepted, peeling the coat closer around her shoulders. She ate slowly, methodically, as if each bite was a test of trust in herself. I watched the horizon, noting clouds that threatened early snow, the thinness of the pasture grass, the leaning posts of fences that needed repair. Her gaze wandered briefly, assessing, measuring, but never wandering into doubt. I realized she was cataloguing the land, the tasks, the rhythm of life, much as I had. She was not trying to escape, not yet. She was calculating, evaluating, surviving in a new way, quietly. By late afternoon, she had begun helping more actively. I handed her another tool, and without a word, she knelt to tighten a wire, working with precision. I continued to the next post, glancing occasionally to ensure she wasn't struggling. Her posture remained upright, strong, even as her raw wrists burned under the effort. She did not complain. She did not pause unless necessary. I began to understand that her silence was not fear, nor submission. It was observation, a careful management of energy and trust. Evening crept upon us with an orange slant of light across the hills. The cold deepened. She did not move closer to the stove, choosing instead to remain near the chicken coop, inspecting the old hinges I had planned to replace. She measured them, traced the lines with rough hands, and began attempting repairs herself, finding wire and rusted nails in a corner pile. She was not seeking approval, and I did not offer it. When we returned to the cabin, she ate little, a few bites of salted pork and bread. Her eyes never strayed from my movements, alert but not anxious. I cleared the table, lit the oil lamp, and prepared a small divider from old feed sacks to give her a sense of privacy. She sat nearby, arms folded around her knees, watching the way I measured space, plotted future repairs. She said nothing. I hammered slowly, methodically, letting the sound fill the silence, allowing her presence to exist as part of the space rather than an intrusion. Night settled, low and unremarkable. The fire burned down to embers, the cold pressing at the walls. I watched her settle on the cot I had offered. She had tested it, judged it, and accepted it without comment. Her breathing evened. I lay in the larger bed across the room, staring at roof beams, counting knots as a distraction from thoughts I would not speak aloud. Outside, the wind carried distant howls, a reminder that the world beyond the cabin was still capable of violence. But inside, trust began to form, not in words, not in promises, but in shared space, in shared labor, in mutual recognition of presence without imposition. By morning, she would follow again, learning, adapting, choosing her participation as she saw fit. And I would continue my routine, adapting as well, making room for her presence without forcing connection. For now, the unspoken agreement was enough. Survive. Observe. Begin again. The morning light was thin and cold when I stepped outside. Frost edged the wooden troughs, sparkling faintly under the first glimmers of sun. I moved through the tasks with practiced rhythm, checking fences, lifting the barn door just so to avoid strain on the old hinges, feeding the mule and the hens. Each motion was methodical, a ritual I had followed for years, yet today it felt different. She was moving behind me, a silent shadow, taking in everything, cataloguing the patterns, learning the land with careful eyes. I noticed the way her bare feet pressed against the frozen ground, cautious yet unflinching. The redness on her soles hinted at discomfort, but she continued without pause. She was watching, calculating, always observing before acting. When I leaned down to inspect a post, she stepped forward, offering a hand to steady the support beam I intended to replace. I did not take it, but her action spoke volumes. She was learning not just the land, but the rhythm of my life, the cadence of a man who had lived alone for decades. She followed as I moved along the north fence line, her movements precise, deliberate, mimicking my motions without instruction. She was fast to grasp the essentials: how to tie the wire without it slipping, how to set the post so it would bear the weight of tension. I could see her mind working, each motion a careful calculation. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to warm the frost, she had begun to pick up additional tasks herself. She retrieved the scattered tools, measured the gaps in the fence, and attempted minor repairs without waiting for my guidance. The wind whipped across the pasture, carrying dust and loose straw in swirls around our boots. She never faltered, never complained. Even her raw wrists, still tender from yesterday's labor, did not slow her. I realized she was not seeking approval or gratitude. She was simply present, acting with the autonomy she had not allowed herself to exercise for years. The understanding between us was unspoken but growing stronger. I worked beside her, observing without interference, allowing her agency to unfold naturally. When midday came, we rested on a fallen log, the wind biting through our coats. She took out a small piece of dried meat and bread, eating slowly, deliberately. Her eyes flicked over the land, the fences, the horizon, measuring, assessing. There was a focus in her gaze, a quiet intensity that reminded me of the first time I had stood alone on this land years ago. She was learning not only how to work, but how to exist here without fear. The afternoon was dedicated to repairs beyond the fence. The chicken coop needed a new hinge, the old one rusted and warped. She knelt beside me, inspecting the broken parts with careful hands, her fingers tracing the shapes, understanding the mechanics intuitively. I handed her a small hammer and nails. She worked silently, determined, her movements precise, almost elegant. The wind carried dust around our feet, and I caught myself glancing at her often, noting her endurance, her capacity to adapt, her determination to maintain control over herself despite the constraints of her past. As the day waned, we returned to the cabin, the cold now settling more firmly into the valley. She did not eat much, a few bites of pork and bread, but her eyes followed my every motion, alert yet calm. I cleared the table, lit the lamp, and set about preparing the room for the night. She remained nearby, observing, silent. I noticed her calculating the space around her, considering privacy, assessing where she could move freely without intrusion. Her presence was quiet but commanding, a constant awareness that shifted the rhythm of the space without imposing. Night fell quickly. The fire in the stove was banked, casting low amber light across the room. She lay on the cot, arms drawn under the blanket, eyes wide open at first, gradually softening into rest. I lay across the larger bed, counting knots in the roof beams to distract myself from memories I had long tried to suppress. There was no conversation, no need for it. The room was filled with shared silence, a mutual understanding that presence itself could be enough. I thought about the past, how the land had been a refuge, how routine had kept my grief manageable. Now, with her here, a new rhythm was emerging. I observed how she had learned to navigate the cabin, the yard, the fences. Every action she took was measured, deliberate, a silent communication of trust and resilience. She was learning the land, but also learning me, observing without intrusion, participating without surrender. Outside, the wind carried distant sounds, coyotes howling, the rustle of dry leaves. Inside, the warmth of the fire spread slowly across the floorboards. Her breathing had evened, the tension in her shoulders lessened. She was beginning to understand that here there was no immediate threat, no expectation of obedience, no force applied to her will. She could exist, learn, move, and work without fear. By the next morning I knew she would follow me again, picking up new tasks, exploring the boundaries of this land and our unspoken arrangement. And I would continue, adjusting my routines subtly to accommodate her presence, allowing her autonomy, observing without interfering. This was not merely labor. It was the foundation of trust, a slow building of connection through shared space and action. For now, that was enough. Survival, observation, and the beginning of understanding. That was all that mattered. The next morning arrived with frost thicker than the day before, a crispness that bit at exposed skin and turned breath into tiny clouds. I moved through the chores with the same care as always, but now her presence added a new dimension to the work. She walked beside me, wrapped in the coat I had given her, bare feet now protected by the worn moccasins. Each step she took was deliberate, careful of the frozen ground, yet unafraid. The northern wind cut through the valley, sharper than any winter I remembered, and I realized quickly that the fence lines would need reinforcement. We worked in silence, side by side, moving posts, tightening wires, and resetting supports. She followed each instruction I gave without needing words, reading the unspoken rhythm of the land and my movements. Occasionally I would glance at her hands, calloused, capable, steady despite the cold, and I felt a sense of relief that she could endure what the land demanded. By midday, the sun had risen high enough to melt some of the frost, but the chill lingered. I stopped near the barn and took a moment to measure the feed supply. Winter would come fast this year, and the mules, the hens, and even I would need every bit of preparation we could manage. She crouched beside me, observing the piles of oats and hay, noting where additional storage would be necessary. Her eyes held that sharp focus again, the same that had first caught mine at the auction, unyielding and precise. I handed her a hammer and pointed toward a leaning post near the south fence. Without hesitation, she took the tool, adjusted the post with one hand, and pounded it into place with the other. The rhythm was instinctual, almost elegant, a combination of strength and precision that spoke of a life shaped by necessity. I moved on to the next task, knowing she would complete this one without guidance. Watching her work, I felt the first flicker of a connection beyond mere presence. It was silent, subtle, but undeniable. Lunch came quietly. I set a small pot of beans and bread near her spot, noticing she did not reach for it immediately. She watched the yard, the horizon, the fences, before beginning to eat slowly, deliberately. There was a method to her actions, a careful assessment of each bite, each movement, a careful balance of survival and control. I ate my own portion at a distance, acknowledging the boundaries she had set without words, respecting them as if they were as real and tangible as the fences we mended. The afternoon was dedicated to gathering firewood. She followed me into the tree line beyond the barn, her movements deliberate, scanning the ground for usable logs, lifting and stacking with a quiet efficiency that mirrored my own. I noticed the way she assessed each piece of wood before lifting it, testing weight and density as though the task was not just labor, but a lesson in patience and discernment. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, our stack had grown substantially. It was organized, each log placed with care to ensure airflow for drying, the pile stable enough to withstand winter winds. As dusk approached, I led her back to the cabin. The temperature had dropped further, and the fire from the morning had long since died. She carried small pieces of kindling with her, careful not to drop them, learning the balance between utility and care. I set the larger logs in the stove, and she added the smaller pieces. The fire caught quickly, crackling and spilling warmth across the floorboards. She stood near it, hands extended, allowing the heat to penetrate the chill that had settled into her muscles. I noticed the faint redness on her cheeks, a mixture of cold and exertion, and for the first time, I felt a pang of concern. Dinner was quiet, a simple meal of salted pork, bread, and beans. She ate slowly, deliberately, still keeping her eyes on the room rather than on me, but there was a subtle shift. The way she handled the food, the way she arranged her hands in her lap, spoke of cautious comfort, of recognition that she was not in immediate danger. I cleared the table and washed the dishes, leaving her to fold blankets near the stove. Her movements were slow, deliberate, but unafraid. I realized that each night, each small ritual, was teaching her that the cabin was no longer a place of confinement or threat. The night settled in with heavy silence. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. She lay on the cot, wrapped in the blankets I had provided, eyes open at first, tracing the ceiling beams, the flicker of firelight. I lay across my own bed, counting the knots in the beams as I had done countless times before, noting the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle relaxation of her posture. There was no conversation, no need for it. Presence was enough. I thought about the upcoming days. Winter would test us, not just the land, but the limits of patience, trust, and endurance. Yet, observing her now, I realized that we had begun something fragile and vital. A rhythm, a shared understanding without coercion, a bond forming through silent cooperation and mutual respect. She was learning the land, and I was learning her, slowly, deliberately, understanding her presence as a force of resilience rather than a complication. Tomorrow, we would return to the fences, the barn, the coop. Each task, though simple, carried weight, lessons in trust, patience, and recognition. She would continue to follow, to learn, to assert her presence without words, and I would continue to observe, to adjust, to respect the boundaries she silently defined. This was the work of winter preparation, but also the work of building something far more enduring, a cautious, growing connection between two people shaped by solitude, by loss, by survival. As I closed my eyes that night, the warmth of the fire behind the walls and the knowledge of her presence across the room gave me a quiet comfort I had not known in years. We were not yet companions, not yet friends, but we were something else. Two lives intersecting, learning the rhythms of one another without demand, without expectation. The winter would test us, but it would also reveal the possibility of something neither of us had anticipated. Coexistence built not on words, but on shared labor, shared space, and shared endurance. The morning arrived heavy with clouds, thick and grey, pressing low against the horizon. The wind carried the first whispers of snow, cold enough to bite through the layers I had put on, enough to make every movement deliberate and careful. I moved outside with the mules, checking the water trough and the fences, but my eyes kept flicking to the sky. It wasn't just winter coming. It was the first real storm, the one that would test everything we had prepared, everything we had learned in our quiet rhythm. She followed me again, the coat wrapped tight around her shoulders, hands tucked inside, moccasins crunching over the frozen dirt. There was no hesitation this time. Her steps were confident, her gaze steady, scanning the land as I had taught her without even meaning to. She paused at the edge of the pasture, letting the wind hit her face, hair whipping around her features. I realized then that she was not only enduring the cold, she was learning it, reading it like a language she had once been denied. By midday, snow had begun to fall in earnest, small flakes first, then larger, heavier drifts, coating the pasture in a layer of white that softened the lines of the land. The fences, already creaking under the weight of ice, needed constant attention. I handed her a hammer, pointed out a leaning post, and she adjusted it with the same care she had shown before, pounding it into the earth without pause, without complaint. Her hands moved with precision, a silent communication of capability that required no words. I watched her closely, noting the slight redness of her fingers against the pale snow, the way she measured each strike, each movement, as though understanding the world depended on it. The mules needed water, and I realized the trough had frozen over despite my efforts. She helped me break the ice, careful to not spill more water than we could replace. Her actions were deliberate, methodical, and I saw in them a reflection of my own long years of routine. There was no discussion, no instruction beyond the initial gestures. We moved together, a silent team, facing the storm with a shared rhythm that had emerged without acknowledgement. The wind intensified, carrying snowflakes that stung exposed skin. I pulled the coat tighter around my shoulders, noticing she did the same. The cabin would need reinforcement tonight, I knew, and the barn doors too. I sent her ahead to check the small storage shed, guiding her gestures with subtle nods, and she moved through the snow with a careful elegance that reminded me of the resilience I had first noticed at the auction. She didn't falter. She didn't complain. She simply acted, assessing the storm as if it were a challenge rather than a threat. By afternoon, the snow had accumulated nearly a foot deep in some places. The mules struggled over the drifts, their hooves sinking with each step, and she helped lead them back toward the shelter, her hands steady on the reins. I felt a strange reassurance watching her, a realization that she was not only surviving the storm, she was thriving within its demands. Each motion, each correction, each careful adjustment spoke of a mind tuned to observation and action, one that did not need reassurance because it had learned to endure without it. Inside the cabin, we tended to the fire, feeding it steadily as the wind howled outside, rattling the walls and shaking the thin window panes. She moved near the stove, adding small pieces of kindling, her hands precise, calculating, and I felt a growing sense of relief in her competence. The cabin was small, yet in the storm it became a sanctuary, a shared space where survival depended not on ownership or command, but on mutual attention and care. I watched her eyes as they followed the flames, reflecting light and warmth, and I recognized a quiet understanding. She was beginning to trust the rhythm of this place, to trust the possibility of safety without needing constant vigilance. Dinner was quiet, another simple meal of beans and salted pork, bread torn in halves. She ate deliberately, slowly, pausing to lift her gaze occasionally to the window, observing the storm's progress. I noticed how her posture had softened slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing, the rigid uprightness giving way to a subtle ease that I had not seen before. Even in silence, even without acknowledgement, we were communicating. Survival, endurance, and now, perhaps, trust. Night came with a relentless blizzard. I checked the locks, reinforced the shutter on the main window, and finally settled by the fire. She lay on the cot, blankets drawn close, eyes open at first, tracing the shadows cast by the flickering flames. I could hear the faint sound of her breath, even and controlled. We did not speak. There was no need. The storm outside had become a language of its own, a lesson in shared endurance. She was learning, as was I, that survival was not just about labor. It was about presence, awareness, and trust in the rhythms of each other. The hours passed slowly. The storm raged, pressing against the cabin with a force that reminded me of the harshness of the land we had chosen to live in. I noticed her occasionally shift, stretching stiff muscles, adjusting her blankets. She did not speak, but I could sense the subtle negotiation of comfort and caution in each movement. When I glanced at her, her eyes met mine briefly, calm, alert, unafraid. It was the first time I felt the fragile bond between us manifest as something tangible, acknowledgement of survival shared, not imposed. By dawn, the storm had abated, leaving the world outside transformed into a landscape of white silence. We emerged carefully, assessing the damage, the drifted fences, the paths made nearly impassable by snow. She followed closely, vigilant, hands ready for any task. Together, we began the work of repair, restoring the land to order after the storm's chaos, our movements synchronized, our silence profound yet full of meaning. There was no need for words. We understood each other in the language of labor, observation, and endurance. The first storm had tested us. It had demanded vigilance, patience, and skill, and in facing it, we had discovered something deeper than mere survival. We had discovered a rhythm, a trust, and a shared understanding of presence without domination. She was not mine, and I was not hers, but in that snow-laden morning, amid wind and frost and labor, we were together, connected by circumstance, effort, and the quiet recognition that survival was more than endurance. It was acknowledgement, respect, and the beginning of an unspoken bond. The storm had passed, but its presence lingered in the cabin, in the way the walls creaked and the floorboards shifted beneath our weight. I moved through the space with the familiarity of long years, but now there was an awareness of her presence that shaped every motion. She had woken before dawn, sitting quietly on the cot, coat wrapped around her shoulders, eyes tracing the lines of the stove, the table, the beds. I could sense her taking inventory of the room, assessing the tools, the space, the rhythm of my daily tasks. There was a caution in her stillness, but also a curiosity, an acknowledgement that she was beginning to stake out her own corner of this world without being told she could. I started with the stove, stoking the fire, scraping away ash and laying new wood carefully to keep the heat steady. She rose from the cot, slow and deliberate, carrying the water I had set to boil. Her hands were steady, but I noticed the slight tremor as she lifted the pail, the remnants of past weakness, perhaps, or simply the adjustment to this life of labor and responsibility. I did not speak, did not offer instruction. I watched, learning her limits, gauging the precision of her movements. She had learned quickly, faster than most would have in my shoes, and that told me more than any words could. Breakfast was prepared in quiet coordination. I cut pieces of bread, salted the pork lightly, and she poured coffee into tin cups, letting the steam curl up between us. There was no conversation, but there was rhythm, a cadence of shared work that conveyed more than speech ever could. She sat cross-legged on the floor by the fire, coat over her knees, eyes occasionally flicking to my hands as they moved with practiced efficiency. I felt the weight of observation, not judgment, but interest, a desire to learn, to understand, to map this life as carefully as she mapped the land outside. The day stretched forward, measured in chores. I took her to the chicken coop, showed her the new hinge I had fashioned from spare metal, demonstrating the way to fit it without force, without unnecessary pressure. Her hands imitated mine, yet she found her own rhythm, adjusting angles subtly, correcting small errors with quiet determination. I saw a satisfaction flicker in her eyes, not of pride in the work itself, but in the mastery of it, the competence regained after long years of disempowerment. By noon, the cabin felt warmer, not just from the fire, but from the sense of shared labor. She moved freely now, tending small tasks, stacking wood, wiping surfaces, preparing for the evening's meal without a word of instruction. The silence between us was no longer awkward. It had transformed into a language of its own. We spoke in gestures, glances, shared glances of comprehension. Each task completed was an affirmation of capability, trust, and respect. I began to notice small habits in her, the way she tilted her head when assessing a problem, the way she measured space with her hands, the precise attention to detail that marked everything she touched. It was a lesson in observation, patience, and subtlety, and I found myself adjusting my own pace to match hers. We moved through the cabin, the yard, and the pasture as a single entity, unspoken and coordinated. The first storm had revealed our survival instincts, but now the calm days were teaching us another kind of endurance, the endurance of patience, routine, and quiet trust. In the afternoon, I showed her how to split firewood properly. She stood close, observing the angle of the axe, the swing, the placement of the log. When I handed her the axe, she held it with a natural strength, hesitating only for a fraction of a second before delivering each swing with careful precision. I felt a mixture of awe and relief. This was no longer a person surviving by necessity, but one rediscovering skill and autonomy. I watched her muscles flex, the sinew in her arms and back responding to the physical demand, and I realized that her silence was no longer a sign of fear but of concentration, of reclaiming control over her body and her actions. Evening approached with a slow descent of grey light over the hills. We returned to the cabin, shoulders aching, hands raw from work, but with a quiet satisfaction that only comes from honest labor and mutual effort. She carried water for the stove, I chopped vegetables, and the cabin became a sanctuary again, filled with warmth, the smell of cooked food, and the sound of routine, each motion echoing respect and understanding. She set the table simply, placing tin cups and plates with meticulous care, and I realized she was learning not just the work but the rhythm of life here, the ways to make space for herself without demanding it. Night fell, and we sat by the fire, each engaged in silent contemplation. I observed her closely, noting the slight softening of her gaze, the way she finally allowed herself to lean back slightly, letting the blankets fall naturally over her legs. She had begun to trust this space, the rhythm of life we had established, and even though she spoke no words, her presence was a testament to the bond forming between us, a bond rooted in labor, observation, and the quiet acknowledgement of each other's autonomy. Sleep came slowly. She chose the cot, pulling the blankets tight to her chest, hands tucked close, eyes alert but not tense. I lay on the larger bed, staring at the ceiling beams, counting knots as I often did, but now my thoughts kept returning to her, the steadiness she had shown, the precision, the independence. We were not yet companions in the traditional sense, not yet friends or allies beyond necessity, but we were learning the same lesson. Life required cooperation, trust, and patience. The cabin, the chores, the rhythm of survival were our instructors, and together, we were learning, growing, and carving out a fragile but enduring understanding. Morning would come again, cold and bright, with new chores, new lessons, and new quiet victories. And I knew, as I drifted toward sleep, that she had become more than a presence under my roof. She had become a reflection of resilience, a reminder that trust could be earned slowly, patiently, without force, and that even in silence, we could teach and learn from each other. The first hints of spring were creeping over the hills, timid green pushing through the brittle yellow of winter's residue. The frost still lingered in the mornings, clinging to the wooden fence posts and the thin wire strung across the pasture, but the warmth of the sun carried a promise that stirred the soil and roused the mules from their lethargy. I had always marked the seasons by the state of the land, the behavior of the animals, and the smell of the air. But now, with her beside me, even the smallest changes carried significance. Her movements, her adjustments, the way she observed every detail as if cataloguing it all to understand this new world she had stepped into. We began with the north pasture, where the fence had taken the brunt of the winter storms. Broken posts leaned at dangerous angles, wires sagged, and the mud from the thaw had undermined sections of the ground. I handed her a post and a hammer, careful not to say a word about how to hold them. She lifted the timber as though it were an extension of her own body, muscles flexing naturally, and began driving it into the soft soil. Her posture was exact, unyielding yet fluid, and I realized she had absorbed more from watching me than I could have taught her with instructions. The sun rose higher, turning frost to mist, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. She moved between posts with precision, adjusting wires, tying knots in a rhythm that almost mirrored my own. It was silent work, punctuated only by the occasional thwack of the hammer and the creak of old wood settling. The land, scarred by winter and neglect, began to transform under our hands. Every upright post, every taut wire, every section mended was a silent testament to coordination and mutual understanding. Mid-morning I paused, leaning on the handle of my hammer, watching her from a distance. Her hair was braided tightly now, strands falling against her neck, damp from sweat and the thawing snow. She lifted a plank, balanced it carefully, and set it into place without hesitation. I marveled at her endurance. The ordeal of the auction, the years of captivity, and the harsh life she had endured had not dulled her strength. It had refined it, honed it into precision and resolve. In that moment, I realized she was not merely adapting. She was asserting herself in this new landscape, claiming space through work and presence. We took a brief pause, sitting on an old log at the edge of the pasture. She did not speak, but I saw her glance at the horizon, tracing the hills where the snow had melted first, following the streams that swelled with runoff from higher ground. I offered her a sip from my canteen, and she accepted without a word, the moisture meeting parched lips, then returned the canteen with steady hands. The silence was comfortable, not imposed, but chosen. It was a language formed in glances, gestures, and shared labor. By afternoon, the mud had hardened into a forgiving surface, and we moved to the south pen, where the chicken coop's door had warped during the freeze. She examined it closely, her fingers tracing the edges, testing the hinge. Without waiting for instruction, she fetched wire, positioned the panels, and began adjusting the mechanism. I observed, noting her patience, the way she corrected slight misalignments, and the care she applied to every touch. This was more than work. It was trust in action. She trusted the task, and by extension, she trusted the environment, the tools, and indirectly, me. The shadows lengthened, and the cold of early spring seeped back in. We carried the last of the wood into the cabin, stacking it neatly beside the stove. I noticed her hands, calloused but precise, moving with purpose and economy. The fire was coaxed to life, flames licking the damp logs, and the cabin took on a warmth that seemed to penetrate more than just the skin. She placed a pot of water to heat, and I began chopping vegetables for the evening stew. Our movements intersected without collision, like two dancers in perfect synchronization. There was no spoken direction, no hierarchy imposed, only the recognition of each other's rhythm. As dusk approached, I stepped outside to survey the land. Footprints pressed into soft earth, leading from the cabin to the fields, marking our passage and progress. I traced them with my eyes, realizing how the pattern mirrored the subtle transformation within the cabin as well. She had moved from observer to participant, her presence altering the cadence of daily life. I did not call her over. She came on her own, boots muddied, hair loose in strands around her face, eyes steady and alert. She scanned the land with me, silent, yet fully present. Evening descended with a cool wind that whispered through the budding branches. We returned to the cabin, tending the fire, preparing food with practiced quiet. She chose a spot near the stove, laying the blanket across her knees, watching the flames as I dished out the stew. She ate deliberately, slowly, methodically. There was no conversation, no need for affirmation, yet there was understanding in the shared act. Trust, it seemed, had begun its slow, invisible weaving between us. Later, after the dishes were cleaned and the water basin replaced, she lingered near the window, observing the moonlight on the hills. I caught her profile against the faint glow, noticing a subtle relaxation in her posture, a sign that the rigidity of the past was easing, if only slightly. We did not speak. Words were unnecessary. She was learning the rhythm of survival here, the cadence of cooperation without compulsion. She had discovered that she could act, contribute, and exist without subjugation or demand. Night settled, and we prepared for sleep. She climbed onto the cot, blankets wrapped tightly, eyes focused on the dim firelight. I lay on the larger bed, listening to the subtle noises of the cabin, the settling wood, the hiss of the fire, her quiet breathing. It was a symphony of endurance, patience, and the quiet acknowledgement that we were no longer merely two individuals occupying the same space. We were participants in a shared life, shaping it silently, cautiously, yet irrevocably. The spring thaw was more than a change in the seasons. It was a renewal, a test of strength, of patience, and of understanding. And I knew, as I drifted into the half-light of sleep, that she had begun to trust the world again, that she had begun to trust me, and that the rhythm of life, labor, and observation would continue to bind us together, imperceptibly but profoundly. The morning air was sharp with the last remnants of winter, but the promise of warmth lingered in the sunlight spilling across the pasture. The mules stirred in the barn, shifting hooves against the straw, the sound echoing faintly in the high wooden beams. I had been tending to them for years, learning their temperaments, their subtle cues, the flick of an ear, a tail's twitch, the way a hoof landed against the earth. Today, however, was different. Today she would ride with me, and I could sense the caution behind the stillness she carried like a second skin. I led her to the corral, where the largest mule awaited. Its coat was roughened by winter winds, its hooves cracked from frozen soil. She approached cautiously, eyes flicking between the animal and me, measuring distance, assessing threat. I did not speak, only watched, letting her study it. She lifted her hand slowly, letting the mule sniff, then patting its neck with careful pressure. The animal accepted her immediately, sensing the steadiness beneath her tentative touch. I saddled the mule, demonstrating silently, making sure every strap was secure, every cinch tight enough without pinching. She observed closely, then mimicked my movements, adjusting the saddle, testing the girth. Her hands were sure, controlled, precise, the way someone who had survived much more harrowing circumstances naturally became exact in small, essential tasks. By the time she finished, the mule seemed relaxed, standing tall, ready to move. We mounted at the edge of the pasture. I went first, my boots sliding into the stirrups, reins in hand. She followed, movements cautious but deliberate. The mule beneath her shifted slightly, testing her balance, but she adapted, shoulders squared, spine straight, eyes forward. I led us across the field, a slow rhythm, punctuated by the soft clop of hooves on thawing earth. Her hands occasionally brushed the reins, guiding the animal with gentle nudges, her body leaning into every turn with fluidity that suggested she had been made for adaptation, for survival. The trail ahead wound through the northern hills, where the snow had begun melting into rivulets that carved through the soil, exposing dark, damp earth. The path was narrow, bordered by thin trees and jagged rocks, requiring constant attention. I could feel her tension, the taut line of her arms, the way her jaw set. It was instinctive vigilance, the same that had carried her through auction blocks, raids, and countless days of uncertainty. She did not speak, but her presence beside me radiated attention and awareness, each step a negotiation of trust between rider and beast. We reached the ridge just as the sun broke fully over the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley below. She tilted her head slightly, drinking in the sight, a subtle softening of her posture. It was the first hint of relaxation I had seen in weeks. The mules stepped carefully along the narrow track, sure-footed, their hooves echoing in the quiet expanse. She leaned slightly forward, urging her animal along, and I realized she was not merely following. She was participating in the flow of movement, learning the subtle communication between human and creature. By mid-morning, we had reached the stream that ran along the base of the eastern hill. Water spilled over rocks, glinting in the sunlight, and the mules paused, sniffing and snorting. I dismounted and let her slide down, watching her hesitation as she placed one bare foot into the cold current. She tested the water, felt its bite against her skin, then followed, stepping carefully across the stones. I kept my eyes on her, noticing the way she measured each movement, calculating risk, testing balance. The past could have taught her caution, but the present demanded trust, not only in me, but in herself. After crossing, we remounted and continued along the ridge, moving towards the northern pastures that had been stripped by winter storms. Broken branches littered the ground, mud patches slowed the mule's pace, and hidden dips threatened to unseat an unsteady rider. She adapted quickly, leaning, pressing her legs, shifting her weight with instinctive precision. It struck me how much she had learned in silence, through observation and endurance, how the small, repeated acts of survival had prepared her for this seemingly ordinary challenge. By noon, we had reached the old oak at the center of the field. Its branches stretched wide, casting dappled shade over the earth. We dismounted, letting the mules graze while we took a moment to rest. She crouched beside the oak, hands brushing the grass, eyes scanning the landscape, alert yet calm. The sun warmed her back, and I could see the first signs of acceptance in the subtle relaxation of her shoulders. We had faced the trail together, and though not a word had passed between us, a silent acknowledgment formed in the shared experience, the recognition that trust could be extended and received without demand. The ride back was quieter. Our rhythm matched, a slow, steady march across thawing pastures. I noticed her occasionally glance at me, not with inquiry, but with assessment, her eyes measuring the land, the animals, and my movements. We were companions now, bound by shared effort, not obligation. The mules carried us back to the barn with patient steps, and as we dismounted, she ran her hand along the animal's neck one last time, then straightened, gaze forward, expression unyielding yet unguarded. Evening settled over the farm with soft light brushing the hills. The animals were fed, the tools cleaned, and the cabin held a quiet warmth. She lingered near the stove, blankets around her shoulders, watching the fire flicker. I noticed the small signs of confidence, the slight relaxation in her stance, the way her hands moved without hesitation. The first ride had been a test, a trial of coordination, trust, and adaptation. She had passed, and in doing so, she had taken another step toward reclaiming autonomy in this new life. I watched her as I prepared our simple supper, noting the subtle changes in her posture, the faint glimmer of ease that had not existed before. Words were still scarce, but the language of action had spoken volumes. Trust, endurance, and observation, these were our shared currency. And I realized that even in silence, a profound connection had been forged, one that would grow stronger with every day spent on this land, side by side, facing whatever challenges came next. The wind shifted abruptly that afternoon, a cold edge slicing through the valley as dark clouds rolled over the northern hills. The mules grew restless in the corral, their ears flicking, hooves scraping against the packed earth. I could sense her tension before she spoke, though she rarely spoke, but the stiffness in her shoulders and the quick, assessing glances told me the storm had awakened something old, something wary. We moved quickly to secure the animals, tying them in tighter, checking the barn doors, securing loose boards. She worked silently, following my motions without instruction, her hands steady even as the wind tugged at her hair and clothes. Each task completed without hesitation, yet I could see the cautious calculation in her eyes, the instinct to anticipate danger before it arrived. The first drops of rain fell in thick, icy sheets, splattering against the wooden roof of the barn. I motioned for her to come inside. She hesitated only for a moment, then stepped in, brushing the wet from her coat and settling near the fire. The storm rattled the cabin, wind whistling through the gaps in the walls, and I felt a protective urge I hadn't known I still carried. She didn't flinch, didn't ask for comfort, but I could see her watching every shadow, every movement in the flickering light. As night fell, the storm intensified. Rain hammered the roof, thunder shook the ground, and lightning split the sky in jagged streaks. We sat on opposite sides of the cabin, neither speaking, yet both aware of the shared experience. She leaned slightly forward, observing, noting the sounds, the changes, the dangers, and I felt the quiet acknowledgement between us. We were no longer strangers. We were survivors, navigating the unpredictable together. Hours passed. The storm did not abate. The mules brayed from the barn, frightened by the fury outside, and I rose to check on them. She followed without question, hands on the barn door, muscles tensed, ready to assist. Together we soothed the animals, guiding them through the panic with calm, deliberate movements. There was no instruction, no demand, only an understanding born of necessity and shared purpose. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, the rain had lessened, and the wind carried only whispers of its previous roar. Mud coated our boots, our clothes were damp, but the bond formed in that night was palpable. Trust had solidified in the crucible of chaos. She looked at me once, not with fear, not with inquiry, but with the quiet acknowledgement that we had endured and survived together. The storm had left the land bruised and battered, the fence lines bowed under the weight of fallen branches, the pasture littered with debris. I woke early, boots crunching over wet earth, and found her already outside, sleeves rolled, sleeves damp with mud, hands gripping a broken post as if it were a lifeline. The cold air bit, but neither of us mentioned it. The work itself demanded full attention. We moved methodically, clearing debris, lifting posts, realigning sagging rails. She worked beside me without speaking, yet every glance, every adjustment, felt like silent communication. I handed her nails, she returned tools, each action precise, measured, as if we were rehearsing a dance we didn't need to name. I watched her muscles flex and relax, the small scars on her hands catching the weak sunlight, and I felt a strange pride, not for her submission, but for her determination. The day stretched, grey and chilly, rain lingering in patches of the field. We paused only for the briefest moments, sharing a piece of bread or a sip of water. No words were exchanged, yet I knew she understood the rhythm of my day, and I hers. She wasn't just following orders. She was contributing, observing, deciding. In the quiet, I realized that for the first time in years, I had someone beside me who didn't need me to tell her what to do, and yet chose to stay. By late afternoon, most of the fence was straight again, the barn door realigned, and the lean-to patched enough to hold against another storm. She wiped the sweat and grime from her forehead, letting the coat I'd given her slip over her shoulders. She didn't ask for warmth, but accepted it silently. I noticed the faint smile she allowed herself in the reflection of the broken window pane. Something inside her was softening, cautiously, but undeniably. As the sun sank behind the western hills, casting long shadows over the repaired land, I leaned against the fence and watched her gather the tools. She moved with a confidence she hadn't possessed when we first met, but her eyes still flicked to mine now and then, acknowledging a shared understanding. The silence between us was no longer tense. It was comfortable, a language we had grown into. I felt the weight of the cabin, the land, the past, and yet, for the first time, it seemed bearable. Evening fell, and we returned to the cabin together, boots muddy, hands rough, clothes damp. She didn't rush to clean, didn't seek comfort, just settled near the fire again. I began preparing supper, glancing occasionally to see her arranging the small things in the room, folding the blanket, straightening the basin. Every movement spoke of her presence, her choices, her agency. And I knew she wasn't mine to control. She never had been, and I never wanted her to be. But she had chosen to remain, and that was enough. That night, as the fire's glow softened the shadows, I sat back on my bed and looked toward her small cot. She lay curled beneath the rough blankets, eyes open, alert but calm. I could see the faint relaxation in her posture, the trust beginning to thread through her vigilance. Tomorrow, the work would continue, the seasons would challenge us again, but we were no longer solitary against the world. We were together in the quiet, in the effort, in the endurance. And for the first time, I let myself believe that survival might not just be about the land or the past. It could be about this fragile, unspoken bond we had formed, solidified through action, patience, and the respect earned without a single word needing to force it. The first snow came quietly, drifting over the pasture in soft, white flakes. The morning air was crisp, sharp, and clean, carrying with it a promise of stillness. I woke to find her already up, standing near the window, watching the flakes settle on the fence posts and the bare earth beneath. Her breath fogged the glass, and she traced shapes absent-mindedly, a small, silent ritual that had become familiar. I dressed quickly, boots crunching over frozen soil, and found her waiting by the barn. The mules stamped their feet, and I noticed how her hands moved instinctively, checking ropes, brushing snow from their backs, her movements confident, precise. I handed her a halter, and she accepted it with a nod. No words, but a subtle acknowledgement passing between us. Together, we led the animals into the shelter, the rhythm of our work unspoken yet perfectly synchronized. By midday, the chores were complete. The snow had begun to thicken, covering the tracks we had made in the morning, erasing the evidence of our passage. I watched her walk across the yard, coat pulled tight, hair braided neatly now, her silhouette framed against the stark white land. She paused briefly, glancing toward me, and in that look I felt the culmination of months of quiet companionship, of trust built in labor, in patience, and in survival. Returning to the cabin, we carried firewood, stacked neatly by the stove. She moved with ease, placing her bundle down without fuss, then took a seat near the window, hands folded over her knees. I began preparing a simple meal, the warmth of the stove filling the room, the aroma of cooking blending with the faint scent of pine and snow outside. The silence was no longer heavy. It was shared, comfortable, a testament to the bond that had grown between us. That evening, as the fire glowed and shadows danced across the walls, I noticed her eyes lingering on the ring I had pocketed months ago, the one that once symbolized loss and memory. She did not speak, did not question, merely observed with quiet curiosity. I placed the stew in front of her, and she began eating slowly, deliberately, as if marking each bite as her own choice. In that moment, I realized that she was no longer simply surviving beside me. She was living, fully, on her own terms, and yet choosing to share this space. Night fell fully, covering the cabin in a blanket of silence, punctuated only by the occasional gust of wind outside. I watched her settle into the cot, blankets wrapped snugly around her, and felt a profound sense of peace. She had survived storms, both of nature and of men, and now, in the quiet of this winter night, she had found a measure of safety and trust. I lay back on my own bed, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, the faint creaks of the cabin, and the distant howl of a lone coyote. The pasts we carried, the grief, the scars, the solitude, no longer dictated every moment. Together we had forged something fragile but unbroken, a life lived side by side, built on respect, patience, and shared endurance. And in that shared silence, as the fire dwindled to embers, I understood the truth we had both discovered. Life could continue, not as a series of lonely days measured by routine and memory, but as a partnership, quiet and steady, in which both of us had a place, and both of us a choice. She had chosen to remain, and I had chosen to let her. The land, the storm, the past, all had shaped us, but they did not define the future. That future began tonight, in the warmth of the cabin, in the trust that had grown without words, and in the knowledge that we would face each day together, not as master and captive, not as owner and property, but as two people who had endured and had chosen each other nonetheless. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope, and she, too, allowed the faintest whisper of safety to linger in her chest. Tomorrow, the work would continue, the seasons would challenge us, and the land would demand more of our strength. But tonight, we were here, together, and that was enough. If you were in his place, would you have fought the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and explore the other videos on your screen.